Steve Jobs. Even just the name conjures up an image. Perhaps you are holding an iPhone in your hand, or maybe you have a MacBook on your desk, or you've seen the Apple logo lighting up the sign of a store in town. But behind the success, slick designs, and billion-dollar company was a person who was brilliant, ruthless, visionary, and deeply flawed. Steve Jobs did not experience a straight line of success. It was filled with failure, conflict, and an unwavering commitment to achieve a standard of perfection. He did not just create another company, he developed an economic model that would change everything about how a business operates. And today we will be doing a deep dive into not only what Steve Jobs did, but how he did this magnificently, detailing his strategies, his failures, and the economic principles behind the empire he built. Steve Jobs was born on February 24, 1955 in San Francisco, California. His biological parents were young university students and ultimately made the decision to put him up for adoption, and he was taken in by Paul and Clara Jobs, a working-class couple from Mountain View, California. Paul Jobs was a machinist, and early on he introduced Jobs to electronics, compensating him with a background for the importance of precision and craftsmanship, which would ultimately define Jobs' obsession with details of product design. But what really set him apart from other individuals was not Jobs' technical knowledge, but Jobs' ability to see patterns and opportunities where others did not. In the early 1970s, Jobs attended Reed College, but dropped out after a semester. However, Jobs did take a class that interested him. He took a calligraphy class that would subsequently serve in influencing typography and philosophy of design of Apple products. Shortly thereafter, he embarked on a journey to India, exploring the spirituality and minimalism of the Eastern culture, which would provide the underpinnings for his future aesthetic of product simplicity, elegance, and usefulness. Jobs always thought beyond the hardware. He recognized that the organizations that would ultimately dominate the future would not be selling simple products, but rather controlling entire ecosystems of information. This is where Jobs' first significant economic contribution begins: the ecosystem economy. Jobs certainly did not invent the idea, but he recognized early on that rather than selling standalone products, in building a business where all of Apple's products and services were interconnected to create switching costs to make it difficult to leave the Apple ecosystem. Most businesses focus on one transaction and have little thought beyond that. However, Jobs built a model to make it so once you entered into Apple's ecosystem, there was no way out. The Mac connected to the iPhone synced to iTunes, and the iTunes store led to an Apple Music subscription. The ecosystem was not just a business model, it was an economic defense mechanism that made it difficult for competitors to entice Apple's customer base. He didn't invent it, though. Disney had been using it in the entertainment industry ages ago. But he was the first to deliberately and intentionally apply this model and make it a force in the consumer electronics industry. Apple's development, Apple and the personal computing revolution. Now let's retrace some time, back to 1976, when Jobs teamed up with Steve Wozniak, a brilliant engineer who designed the Apple and Apple II computer. Wozniak was responsible for the technical aspects, while Jobs was responsible for everything else: marketing, design, and vision for what Apple could be. Back then, personal computers were seen as niche machines, usually for hobbyists or corporate offices. Jobs viewed it differently. He believed that computing was inherently personal, meaning that a computer should be an extension of one's creativity, a vision that would follow in today's electronic world. In 1977, Apple launched the Apple II, which was one of the first mass-market personal computers and was an amazing success. However, it was not just the technical specifications. Jobs made sure the personal computer was visually appealing and easy to use. He introduced branding as a key competitive advantage by packaging the Apple II computer in a way that felt inviting, easy to use, and almost fashionable. This was a significant moment as it marked one of the first meaningful shifts in technology marketing. Computers were not just machines any longer, they were products with identity. However, Jobs' obsession with control and perfection over the user experience meant that he was not just running a computer company, he was creating a closed economic system. Unlike Microsoft, which sold software to different hardware manufacturers, Apple controlled both the hardware and the software inside the machine. This vertical integration model meant that Apple may have had higher costs, but it also meant they were able to provide a higher quality product with better control of the user experience and ultimately greater customer loyalty. Economically, this is differentiation, and in this case, Apple positioned itself as not a cheap option, but rather as the best crafted and innovative product, allowing them to charge premium pricing. This would become the basis of Apple's economic model for the next several decades, which did not start pleasantly. The declining 80s, by the early 1980s, Apple was a fairly large company, in Jobs' company style, demanding, confrontational, and obsessive, was starting to create tension. In 1983, Jobs recruited John Sculley, the former CEO of Pepsi, to help grow Apple into a global corporation. Initially, the relationship was good, but soon it became conflictual. Jobs wanted to stay focused on design, innovation, and premium products. While Sculley understood the economic realities, Apple could not be an innovative company without profitability. The tipping point came at the launch of the Macintosh in 1984. The Mac was a revolutionary product. It was a computer with a graphical user interface, GUI, and had an elegant design. However, it was priced too high, and as a result, the product was not accessible to the average consumer. Sales were lackluster, and Jobs' refusal to adjust the selling price or to change the marketing campaign to accommodate pricing became a liability on the board of directors. And in 1985, Jobs was forced out. Most people would have viewed this as the end, but Jobs understood something important and fundamental about business failure. It is not the end, it is simply shifting assets. Rather than disappearing, he shifted these failures into future successes. After his departure from Apple, Jobs started a computer company called Next, which never became a commercial success, but it developed innovative software that Apple adopted later. Perhaps more importantly, Jobs bought a small animation company called Pixar. At that time, Pixar was not producing films, but was selling computer graphics software. Jobs encapsulated it as a storytelling company. As CEO, Jobs forged a partnership with Disney to produce Toy Story, 1995, the first fully computer-animated film, which was hugely successful. Jobs shifted from hardware to content, demonstrating his ability to identify emerging industries. As an example of strategic pivoting, an entrepreneur is able to move from a failure to a profitable business while still using a skill set they established in the prior company. When Disney acquired Pixar, Jobs became Disney's largest shareholder and expanded his reach into the entertainment industry. During the time Jobs was working with Pixar, Apple was struggling without him. By the late 1990s, Apple was headed towards bankruptcy. It was in 1996 when Apple acquired Next, and Jobs returned to Apple. Though he returned to Apple, he changed Apple's business model entirely. And with this, Jobs marks the beginning of a new era, the iRevolution, the birth of the modern Apple empire. Jobs knew that selling computers wouldn't keep Apple afloat. His focus became creating new product categories. In 2001, he launched the iPod. The iPod was not the first MP3 player, but it was the first to be born as part of a larger ecosystem, the iTunes Store. Jobs understood that it was not about selling devices, but controlling what content people consume digitally. This shift in the economy led to the development of the iPhone 2007 and the App Store 2008, which changed Apple and created massive new industries. Apple was no longer just a technology company. Apple was a platform economy with third-party developers building applications for Apple's devices. And these applications created network effects, making Apple even more valuable over time. Jobs passed away in 2011, yet his business strategies are still governing Apple. Jobs' notable lessons: ecosystem effectiveness, emotional branding, vertical integration, and premium pricing have all become normal practices in the industry. Apple is still one of the most valuable companies, not because they sell the most products, but because they have control over the entire customer journey. Jobs did not just start Apple, he rewrote business rules. Jobs' trajectory of failing and then reworking himself is proof entrepreneurship is not about avoiding failure. Entrepreneurship is learning how to leverage failure for future success. The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Steve Jobs.